what happened in the first part of the story. I, a prisoner, was sent on a perilous journey across snow-covered mountains under guard and in chains, along with other convicts. Along the way, we struggled for survival, facing harsh weather conditions, hunger, and the danger of being killed by beasts or falling into an abyss. But the real trouble occurred when a huge werewolf attacked us. Many prisoners and guards died. Only 4 of us remained out of the entire convoy. 3 criminals, a blonde man, an old man resembling a doctor, and myself, as well as 1 young, strong, and handsome guard. We managed to throw the werewolf down a cliff, but it is still alive and preparing for another attack. The second part of the story. The night, like a black veil, consumed everything in its path, every sound and every tiny glimmer of light. The sky was grim, as if it had been cut from an endless fabric of darkness. The moon hung high above, cold-blooded and indifferent to the happenings below. Its light bathed the earth in a pale, cold glow, like a lamp in a lonely corridor. The weak light only emphasized the abyss of darkness surrounding it. The cold pierced through the campfire, its flames tossing and turning in rhythm with the winds, battling against the relentless chill. The night was silent, occasionally broken by the whistle of the wind and the crackling of the burning wood in the fire. "We cannot go down," I said gloomily. The 3 survivors turned to look at me. The young guard spoke first. "Tell us, why can't we go down?" I shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of their attention. Because the monster didn't die. These grim words hung in the air. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me, widening in surprise. "How did you come to that conclusion?" After a moment's reflection, I concluded that the werewolf was indeed still alive. Everything pointed to it. I pointed upwards. This creature made a jump from a staggering height, landing here in the path of our convoy of prisoners without a scratch. Why would it have died from falling off a cliff? Neither the guard nor the other prisoners could refute my reasoning. I continued. "This means the beast is still alive, somewhere down the slope of the mountain. Therefore, by turning back, we would be walking right into its jaws." The blonde man cursed loudly and crawled closer to the fire, peering into the darkness with terror in his eyes. The prisoner resembling a doctor rubbed his temples, murmuring, "Of course. Why didn't I realize that?" The young guard proved to be the most resilient of the 3. After pondering, he nodded. "Then we will ascend and cross the mountain pass. But that's not all." He looked in the direction where the werewolf had fallen. "If the creature is still alive, it's likely to return here and then follow us. This means time is of the essence. We must set out at the first rays of the sun." He gestured towards the torn bodies strewn around us. "And that means we can't afford to rest all night. We need to gather supplies right now. If I had my way, I would at least afford these people a modest burial after what's happened, but unfortunately, fate had other plans." He rose to his feet, axe in hand. The blonde man tensed, eyeing the blade, but soon relaxed, realizing that the young guard showed no signs of aggression. "We need to find food, water, warm clothing, and firewood. I suggest we split up, each taking on one of these tasks." Then he pointed to himself. "I'll handle the firewood." The doctor surveyed the stone plateau, most of it submerged in deep shadows, and his expression darkened. "I'll look for water. I remember each guard had a flask. I'll gather as much as I can find." The blonde man also looked around, a strange gleam in his eyes. "Then I'll go looking for food." The last task fell to me. The guard looked at me thoughtfully. "You should find some warm clothing and, first of all, dress yourself. Your appearance is pitiful." he said. Time passed, and far enough from the fire to remain unnoticed in the shadows, I began stripping warm clothes from the deceased guards. Shivering from the cold, I found the last mangled body dressed in a leather fur coat. It was the old guard, the one who had hit me with a club earlier that day for attempting to simply take a flask from the young sentinel. He was mortally wounded and slowly dying, yet astonishingly clinging to life. His chest and abdomen were covered in horrific wounds, and he clearly suffered from the pain. His time was coming to an end. I crouched next to the dying guard, examining him. The old man tried to focus on me and weakly moved his hand, trying to reach for something. I looked down and saw a knife lying nearby. I picked it up with interest. Is this what you were looking for? Why? Do you want to die with a weapon in hand like a Viking? The dying guard did not respond, continuing to look at me with an expression of strong, elusive emotion in his eyes. I understood him without words and sighed. Well, have it your way. In the end, we all meet the same fate. With those words, I leaned forward and ended the old man's suffering, then threw the bloodied knife aside. The guard convulsed, choking on his own blood. The expression in his eyes changed. Was it gratitude or hatred? I did not know. Despite never being a paragon of lawfulness, this was my first killing, and I expected to feel guilt or fear, but felt only emptiness instead. It seems the harsh lessons of life in the slums had prepared me well for this moment. I sat silently next to the old man, seeing him off on his final journey. After some time, I began removing the fur coat and the sturdy leather boots from the corpse. They were officers' gear, noticeably superior in quality to the standard guard's attire. Wearing them, I felt warmth for the first time in a long while, aside from a brief moment by the fire. Perfect. The coat was slightly blood-stained, as was I. I looked around. It seemed my companions were still busy with their tasks. Noticing the blond man, who was supposed to be gathering food for us, I saw him greedily removing watches and jewelry from the fallen instead. Thoughts about the unreliability of my comrades began to take over me. The future appeared exceedingly unclear. Any choice I made could turn into a risky venture. Nonetheless, I realized that a decision for survival was necessary. We spent the remainder of the night sitting by the fire, backs to the flames, tensely peering into the darkness. Fatigue overtook us all, but sleep was not in our plans. The fear was too great that the werewolf might reappear and destroy us. Only the young guard seemed undisturbed, calmly cleaning his weapon by the light of the flame. At dawn, when the sun lazily began to warm the air, we loaded ourselves with the supplies we had managed to gather and ventured into the cold. I looked back one last time at the place that was supposed to be our camp, but had become a graveyard for many. What lay ahead, no one could predict. Soon, we encountered an unforeseen difficulty. Our plan was to follow the road to the mountain pass and cross it before nightfall, striving to get as far away from the site of tragedy as possible. However, the road was destroyed. A recent, perhaps even yesterday's rock slide had erased sections of it from the earth, making passage impossible. I stood at the edge of the abyss, looking down with a vacant gaze. What do we do now? The voice of the convicted doctor was muffled by the collar of his fur coat. The following blonde angrily scanned the surroundings. His gaze settled on me, a suitable target to vent his frustration. "Here's what I suggest. Get rid of the unnecessary baggage," he said discontentedly, glancing at my elegant officer's boots, then addressing the guard. "Listen, boss. This guy is the weakest link. He's holding us back. Besides, he's from that dreadful gang. Who knows what he's thinking? Doesn't he raise suspicions to you?" The sentinel responded with a grim, condemning look, but the blonde didn't back down. I swear he's plotting something devious. Don't you know who he is? This scoundrel is worse than all of us put together. I tried to remain calm. Yes, I was part of the so-called Night Rippers, but I was betrayed by their leader and was now here looking for a way out of this situation. Luck had always eluded me, and I didn't believe in miracles, luck, or divine will. I knew not to trust anyone, not even myself. The blonde insisted, "Shouldn't we get rid of him just in case? He won't last long anyway." The doctor glanced at me sideways, something resembling cold calculation flickering in his gaze. Perhaps it was paranoia, but I felt something was off. Nonetheless, the doctor eventually shook his head. "Let's not jump to conclusions, buddy. He might still prove useful to us." But the blonde started to object, but the guard cut them off, putting an end to the argument. "We're not leaving anyone behind. And as for how much longer he can last, worry about yourself first." The blonde clenched his teeth, but then just waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. So, what do we do now?" All four of us looked at the broken road, then down the slope of the mountain, and finally upwards, where the sheer cliff face had been shattered by falling rocks. After a moment of silence, the doctor finally spoke. "There used to be a trail here, leading to the mountain summit. Workers who were building the prison at the foot of this damn mountain sometimes used it. Later, the administration expanded part of the trail and built a normal road over it, leading, of course, not to the summit, but to the mountain pass." He looked up. "The remains of the original trail should be somewhere above us. If we reach it, we can find a way back to the intact section of the road." We followed his gaze, uncomfortable at the prospect of ascending the treacherous slope. Except for the guard, of course. He remained as calm as a saint. The rock slide had turned the slope from an almost vertical wall into a steep incline. The blonde was the first to speak. "Climb up there? Are you out of your mind?" The old man shrugged helplessly. "Do you have a better idea?" No one did. After some preparation, we began our ascent. The blonde and the doctor stubbornly carried weapons they had picked up from the bodies of dead soldiers. But with some regret, I decided to leave my newly acquired rifle behind. I knew this climb would be a test of endurance. The weapon might not seem too heavy now, but very soon, every extra ounce would feel like a ton. As the weakest member of the group, I was already struggling to keep on my feet, so the choice was small. Walking on the mountain road with supplies on our shoulders was hard enough, but the climb itself proved to be pure torture. Within half an hour, I felt my muscles were about to melt, and my lungs were on the verge of bursting. Gritting my teeth, I continued to move forward and upwards. I had to constantly remind myself to watch how I stepped. On this unstable, icy slope, one wrong move was enough to send a person tumbling down to their death. Just think of something pleasant. But what pleasant thoughts could I possibly have? I remembered when, still a teenager, I found myself in one of the cheap brothels. The slums where I grew up had many such dubious establishments. But that day, the brothel was hosting a cabaret, and I saw the most beautiful woman on stage. Her name was Victoria. Big eyes, plump lips, and luxurious red hair below her shoulders. I fell in love with her at first sight. But she was a star, and I was a street urchin. It was because of her I joined the Night Rippers gang. And because of her, I continue to cling to life to this day. My fate is my curse. But I didn't want to reconcile with my destiny. With all the shit she dragged me through, I should get some reward, and now it's freedom, I thought. Freedom and Victoria, and I want to see her again, even just once, and maybe I really do have a chance. But in the next second, I cursed, feeling that this attempt to treat the wishful as real only made me more depressed and angry. Maybe I'm allergic to daydreaming, I thought. Such an allergy would indeed be ironic, considering I was destined to spend half of my remaining life in prison if caught, and if I even lived long enough. However, my mental escape from reality wasn't entirely futile. Lifting my gaze from the slippery stones under my feet, I noticed the sun had significantly lowered. Thinking about it, the air seemed much colder too. At least it helped pass the time, I thought. Night was approaching. By the time we decided to stop, I was on the verge of fainting. After long hours traversing the uneven mountain slope, my body was almost at its limit. However, to everyone's surprise, it seemed the blonde was even worse off. The dim-witted prisoner's eyes were cloudy and unfocused, aimlessly wandering. His breathing was uneven and shallow, as if something was pressing on his lungs. He looked sick, as though he had a fever. As soon as the guard found a suitable spot for camp, the blonde simply collapsed to the ground. The most frightening part was the absence of the angry curses we had gotten used to. The criminal lay quiet and motionless, only the movement of his chest revealing he was still alive. A few moments later, with a trembling hand, he uncorked his flask and greedily took several large gulps. "Conserve the water," said the young guard, a hint of concern somehow making its way into his usually stoic voice. Ignoring these words, the blonde drank more, completely emptying the flask. The doctor didn't look much better than him. The strenuous climb had severely taxed the older prisoner. Despite the unbearable cold, he was sweating, with bloodshot eyes and a grim expression on his face. Being the weakest of the survivors, I somehow managed to endure better than everyone else. "Can't we just melt snow when we run out of water?" the old man said. The guard gave the doctor a significant look. "There might come a time when we can't light a fire to avoid attracting unwanted attention." No one commented, understanding all too well whose attention we needed to avoid. The memory of how horrific the werewolf seemed was still fresh in our minds. Fortunately, this time the guard managed to find a natural niche in the mountain slope, sheltered behind a narrow outcropping. The fire was well hidden by stones, allowing us to enjoy its warmth without fear of being spotted. No one was in the mood to talk, so we simply roasted pieces of raw meat over the fire and ate in silence. By the time the sky had darkened completely, the blonde and the doctor were already asleep, ensnared in their own nightmares. The guard pulled out his weapon and approached the edge of the cliff outcrop. "Try to get some rest too. I'll keep watch first," he said to me. I nodded at him and lay down by the fire, dead tired. As soon as my head touched the ground, my consciousness plunged into darkness. It seemed like only a second later when someone gently shook and woke me up. Stiff and disoriented, I blinked several times and finally noticed the guard looming over me. Those two didn't look too good, so it's better to give them some time to recover. Don't let the fire go out and wake us at dawn, or if the beast shows up. I silently stood up and swapped places with the guard, who added a couple of logs to the fire and soon fell into a deep sleep. I was left alone for several hours. The night turned out to be surprisingly bright. All clouds had vanished, and the sky bloomed with a multitude of twinkling stars. The large moon illuminated the surroundings as if it were daytime. I sat quietly, looking in the direction we had come from. Despite the progress we had made during the day, I could still see the strip of road. I could even trace it all the way to the stone plateau where the battle with the werewolf had taken place. Tiny dots speckling the stones were the bodies of prisoners and guards. as I watched a dark figure slowly crawled out from the ravine. It remained motionless for a while, then moved forward, scraping its claws against the stones. Each time a claw touched one of the bodies, the werewolf grabbed it and brought it to its mouth. The wind carried the muffled sounds of crunching bones to my ears. It was a ghastly sight. I shuddered, accidentally knocking a small rock off the ledge. It fell, struck the slope, then rolled down, dragging a few more stones with it. The noise of the falling rocks echoed in the quiet night like thunder. Far below, the monster suddenly turned its head and looked straight at me. I froze, petrified. I was afraid to make even the slightest noise. For a moment, I even forgot to breathe. I saw the werewolf looking directly at me but not taking any action. Several excruciating seconds passed, each feeling like an eternity. Then, the monster calmly turned away and continued devouring the dead as if it hadn't noticed me at all. At that moment, a question flashed through my mind. Could it be wounded and blind? I inhaled, watching the werewolf with wide eyes. It was true. The creature couldn't see properly. This was good news for us. Remembering everything that happened earlier, last night, I became more and more convinced of my guess. When I had pushed the stone off the cliff, the werewolf reacted only after the rock began to fall, loudly scraping against the stones. Apparently during the battle, someone had injured its eyes. Now, everything made sense. At dawn, I woke the others. The guard hoped a full night's rest would benefit the blonde and the doctor, but his hopes were not fulfilled. Both prisoners looked even worse than before. It seemed the previous day's climb had overly strained the old criminal. However, the blonde's condition couldn't be explained by mere exhaustion. He was deathly pale and trembling, with half-conscious eyes and a lost gaze. What's wrong with him? The doctor, not feeling too well himself, shook his head helplessly. It might be altitude sickness. It affects everyone differently. His voice sounded hoarse and weak. I'm fine, idiots. Leave me alone. The blonde struggled to form coherent sentences, but insisted he was all right. The guard frowned, then took the bulk of the supplies that the blonde was supposed to carry and added them to his own load. After a moment's hesitation, he handed some to me as well. Did anything happen while we were sleeping? He stared at me for a few seconds. The monster ate the dead, I said briefly. The young soldier's frown deepened. I heard and saw it, I added. The guard approached the edge of the cliff and looked down, trying to discern the distant stone plateau. After a minute or so, he clenched his jaws, showing signs of uncertainty for the first time. Then we'll have to move faster. If the creature finishes with all the bodies, it will come after us. We need to find this old trail before nightfall. Frightened and disheartened, we resumed our journey and continued the ascent. I was slowly dying under the added weight. This is hell, I thought. We climbed higher and higher. The sun rose with them, slowly approaching its zenith. There were no conversations, no laughter, only the sound of labored breathing. Each of the survivors focused on their steps and maintaining balance. However, the blonde fell increasingly behind. His strength was leaving him. And then, at a certain moment, I heard a desperate scream. Turning around, I caught just a glimpse of a panicked face. Then, the blonde slipped backward, his foot slipping on an icy stone. He hit the ground hard and tumbled down, desperately trying to grab onto something. But it was too late. Powerless to do anything, we could only watch as his body rolled down the slope, leaving bloody traces on the stones. With each second, the blonde resembled a human less and more a rag doll. After a few moments, he finally stopped, crashing into a large protruding stone, and turned into a heap of torn flesh. the blonde man died. We stood still, looking down in anxious silence. What happened to the blonde was not a shock to us, but it was still hard to digest. An ominous feeling settled in my heart. Seeing the broken body of my companion made it all too easy to imagine that any of us could face the same fate. No one knew what to say. After a minute or so, the doctor finally said with a sigh, "Good thing you took most of his supplies." A bit heartless, but he's right, I thought, casting a scrutinizing look at the older criminal. The doctor frowned, realizing his mask of a kind gentleman had slipped for a moment, and hastily added in a somber tone, "Rest in peace, my friend." What a farce, I said to myself. In reality, I didn't believe his kind words for a second. Every kid from the slums knew to be wary of people who acted kindly without reason. They were either fools or monsters. The doctor didn't seem like a fool, so I've been wary of him since we met. As I've said, I'm still alive because I was and remain a distrustful cynic, and now was no time to change. "We need to keep moving," the young guard said, casting one last look downwards. His voice was steady, but I felt there were emotions hidden behind it. I just couldn't understand what they were. The doctor sighed and also turned away. I continued to look at the blood-stained stones for a few more seconds. Why do I feel so guilty? I wondered, puzzled by this unexpected reaction. He got what he deserved. Slightly disturbed, I turned and followed the two remaining companions. Ascending at such an altitude became increasingly difficult. The wind hit us with a force capable of knocking an unwary person off balance, making each step seem risky. The air became too thin for breathing. Due to the lack of oxygen, I began to feel dizzy and nauseous. It seemed we were all slowly suffocating. Altitude sickness is not something you can simply overcome by force of will. It's elusive yet dominating, striking the strong and the weak alike, regardless of their physical form and endurance. If unlucky, an elite athlete might succumb before an average person. It was just a matter of the body's innate ability to adapt. The lucky ones might deal with the illness, experiencing only mild symptoms. The rest could end up incapacitated for days or weeks, suffering from various excruciating side effects. Some even died. As if all this wasn't enough, it was getting colder over time. Warm clothes and fur were no longer sufficient to ward off the cold. I was shivering and freezing at the same time, cursing every decision I had made in my life to end up here, on this endless icy slope. This mountain was no place for people. Yet we had to go on. Several hours passed. Despite everything, we kept moving forward, gradually climbing higher and higher. Wherever that old trail the doctor spoke of was, it couldn't be far now. At least, that's what I hoped. But at some point, I began to doubt whether the trail even existed. Maybe the old prisoner lied. Maybe the trail had long been destroyed by time. Maybe we had already passed it without noticing. Just when I was about to despair, we finally found it. It was weathered and narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The path wasn't paved, but rather carved into the black stones, like the tail of a sleeping dragon. Here and there, it was hidden under the snow. But most importantly, it was flat. Never in my life had I been so happy to see something flat. Without a word, the doctor dropped his backpack and sat down. He was deathly pale, gasping like a fish out of water. Despite this, there was a slight smirk on his face. Just as I said. The guard nodded at him and looked around. After a few seconds, he turned back to the triumphant prisoner. "Get up. It's not time to rest yet." The doctor blinked several times, then looked up at him with pleading eyes. Just give me a few minutes." The young guard was about to object, but I placed my hand on his shoulder. He turned to face me. "What's wrong?" "It's gone." "What's gone?" I gestured down in the direction we had come from. "The blonde's body, it's not there." The guard looked at me intently for a few moments. Then he and the doctor simultaneously approached the edge of the stone path and looked down, trying to locate where the blonde had met his end. Indeed, traces of blood were still visible on the sharp rocks, but the corpse itself was nowhere to be found. The doctor flinched and crawled as far away from the edge as possible. The young guard also stepped back, instinctively reaching for his pistol. We all exchanged tense looks, clearly understanding the implication of our former companion's body disappearing. "The monster did it," said the doctor. "It's following us." The guard clenched his teeth. "You're right, and if it's that close, a fight with it will soon be inevitable." The idea of fighting the werewolf was as terrifying as it was absurd. He might as well have said they were all going to die soon. This truth was painfully clear to both me and the doctor, but the old criminal surprisingly didn't look scared. Instead, he lowered his gaze and quietly said, "Not necessarily." We all turned to him, ears perked. "Explain." "Here we go," I realized. The doctor sighed. "The monster tracked us to this place in just one day. The night of the battle, I saw that someone had injured its eyes. This means there are two most likely scenarios. Either it's smart enough to understand where we're headed, or it's following the scent of blood." After some thought, the guard nodded, agreeing with the logic. The old prisoner slightly smiled and continued, "Regardless of which version is correct, we can throw him off our trail and buy ourselves some time." "And how do we do that?" Despite the urgency in the guard's voice, the doctor hesitated and remained silent. "Why aren't you answering? Speak up." The old man sighed again and slowly, as if reluctantly, replied, "I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. We just need to make the guy bleed out. We'll drag him down the trail, leave him there as bait, and then continue our ascent instead. His sacrifice will save our lives." Just in time. All scoundrels are predictable. If I hadn't been angry and, of course, scared to death, I would have smiled. My judgments, as always, were very precise. Confirming one's own guesses is always pleasant, but not in a situation where being right meant potential use as bait for a monster. I recalled the words the doctor said when the blonde insisted on my murder. "Don't be too hasty, my friend. The boy may be of use to us in the future." Words that at the moment sounded benevolent, now, as it turned out, concealed a much more sinister meaning. That bastard! Now it all depended on whether the guard would follow the doctor's plan or not. The young man blinked in surprise. "What do you mean by making him bleed out?" The doctor shook his head. "It's very simple. If the monster knows where we are heading, we have no choice but to abandon our plans to reach the mountain pass. Instead, we must make our way over the mountain peak. If the monster tracks by the scent of blood, we must use one of us as bait to mislead it." He paused. "Only by leaving a bleeding person lower on the trail can we safely escape pursuit, regardless of how it tracks us." The guard stood still, his eyes darting between me and the old prisoner. After a few seconds, he asked, "How could you bring yourself to suggest something so vile?" The doctor masterfully pretended to look dismayed and sad. "Of course, it pains me to speak of such things. But if we do nothing, we will all die. At least the boy's death will save 2 lives. The gods will reward him for his sacrifice." God, what eloquence. I almost believed it myself. The young man opened his mouth, then closed it again, hesitating. I silently observed the two survivors, assessing my chances of winning in a confrontation. The doctor was already halfway to becoming a corpse, so defeating him would not be difficult. The guard, however, posed a serious threat. Did I have enough strength? Now, this serious threat was looking down, avoiding my gaze. His hand rested on his weapon. As always, I had no idea what was going on in the guard's perfectly opaque mind. The uncertainty made me nervous. Finally, after some time, the guard spoke. "I have just one question." The doctor and I stared at him, holding our breath. "Yes, what is it?" "You said that one of us needs to be sacrificed to save the other two. Why him? As far as I can see, you're much closer to the grave." "Excellent question. I'm asking myself the same thing right now." I turned to the prisoner, trying my hardest to suppress a smirk. But to my disappointment, the doctor already had an answer ready. "Before the first attack, he was already bleeding from a blow by your senior guard. During the attack, he was drenched in another prisoner's blood. His cloak is also soaked with his previous owner's blood. The guy simply reeks of blood right now. Keeping him alive puts us at risk. That's why he is the best choice." "Damn you and your big brain." The doctor's argument was terrifyingly convincing. The guard listened, becoming grimmer with every word. Finally, he looked at me, and a dangerous spark flickered in his eyes. "That's true." My mouth went dry. Cold sweat ran down my back. I tensed up, ready to act. But at that moment, the guard smiled. "Your logic is almost irrefutable," he said, pulling out a pistol. "However, you forgot to consider one detail." The doctor raised an eyebrow, trying to hide his nervousness. "And what detail did I forget?" The young guard turned to face him, the smile gone from his face. Now he exuded a powerful, almost tangible intention to kill. "I know who you are, Your Grace. I also know what you did, and how you became a prisoner. Just one of the disgusting crimes you committed would be enough for me to want you dead. So if there's anyone among us who deserves to be sacrificed, it's you." The doctor's eyes widened. But the smell of blood. "Don't worry about that. I'll make you bleed so much that it'll overpower all the odors coming from the guy." Everything happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to blink. The guard lunged forward. A moment later, the doctor fell to the ground with a scream, his leg broken by a single strike. Not giving him a chance to recover, the young guard stepped on the other leg, causing a nauseating sound of bones crushing. The scream turned into a whimper. Just like that, the doctor was dealt with. The brutality of the guard's actions contrasted so sharply with his usual graceful demeanor that I felt my blood run cold. It was horrifying. The guard looked at me and said in a calm voice, "Wait for me here." Then he grabbed the old criminal and dragged him down the trail, soon disappearing behind a stone outcrop. After a few minutes, terrible screams carried through the wind. I was left alone, shivering. Damn, this is too much. I still couldn't believe how sudden the doctor's death was, and how merciless. After some time, the guard returned, acting as if nothing had happened. But it was this very unflappability that unnerved me the most. After sorting through the doctor's backpack and discarding most of the wood, the young guard slung it over his shoulder and said dispassionately to me, "Let's go. We need to hurry." Not knowing what to say, I nodded and moved forward. Now there were only two of us left. It felt silly, but I suddenly felt lonely. Walking along the stone trail was much easier than climbing the mountain slope. I even had time for unnecessary thoughts. A strange sense of melancholy overcame me, somehow making me feel that the end of this nightmare, whatever it was not far off. We walked in silence for a while, but then the guard spoke. Don't feel responsible for what happened. It's not your fault. The decision was mine, and mine alone. The young guard was walking a few steps ahead, so I couldn't see his face. Besides, if you knew about the sins of that man, actually, it's better that you don't. Just take my word for it. His killing was an act of justice. I wonder who feels guilty. People, always trying to justify their actions, always desperately wanting to maintain an illusion of righteousness, even when committing the dirtiest deeds. It was the hypocrisy I hated the most. Receiving no answer, the guard smirked. "You don't like talking, huh? Well, that's wise. Silence is golden." After that, we no longer spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. The sun was setting, painting the world in a million shades of raspberry. At such an altitude, the air was pure and fresh, pierced by the crimson rays of the setting sun. Below, a sea of burgundy clouds slowly drifted by. Stars and the moon began to emerge in the crimson sky. It was incredibly beautiful. Yet all I could think about was how cold it would become once the sun fully set behind the horizon. Before that happened, the guard found us shelter. Not far from the trail, hidden behind large rocks, was a narrow crevice that led into the mountain slope. Pleased to be protected from the piercing wind, we explored the crevice and found ourselves in a small, well-camouflaged cave. I wanted to gather some twigs, but the guard stopped me with a shake of his head. "Tonight, we'll sleep without a fire. The beast is too close." Setting up camp without the warm flames that could have kept us company was unpleasant, but at least we wouldn't freeze to death inside the cave. In any case, the alternative was far too terrifying. I sat down, leaning my back against the cave wall. The guard settled opposite me, looking gloomy and thoughtful. He was clearly in a strange mood. Soon the sun disappeared beyond the horizon and it became completely dark in our little cave. I watched the guard, not wanting to fall asleep. After some time, the guard suddenly whispered, "Are you asleep?" The question echoed in the darkness. I didn't really want to talk to him, but now I had a reason to respond. "And what? Are you waiting for me to fall asleep to kill me? Or will you do it in the morning?" A smile froze on the guard's face. He lowered his head, as if ashamed. After a minute or so of heavy silence, he finally answered, "Yes. I thought that if I did it while you were asleep, you wouldn't have to suffer." Unseen by him, a bitter smile appeared on my face. A long sigh escaped the young guard's lips. He leaned his back against the cave wall, still not raising his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. This sin too I must bear. But please, if you can, find it in your heart to understand. If things were different, I'd gladly face that monster to let you escape. But my life, it doesn't belong to me alone. There's a vast duty I swore to fulfill. Until it is done, I can't afford to die." I laughed. "Oh, these people, look at yourself. Planning to kill me and still insisting you have a good reason. How convenient. I really hate hypocrites like you the most. Why not be honest for once? Don't spout nonsense. Just say it. I'm going to kill you because it's easier. I'm going to kill you because I want to survive." The guard closed his eyes, his face filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry. I knew you wouldn't understand." "What's there to understand?" I leaned forward, anger coursing through my veins. "Tell me, why should I die?" The young guard finally lifted his gaze. Though he couldn't see in the darkness, he turned his head my way. That man was a scoundrel, but he was also right. "You smell too strongly of blood. It will attract the beast. You could simply let me go. We'll part ways. After that, whether the monster finds me or not is no longer your concern. The guard shook his head. To die in the jaws of that creature, it's too cruel a fate. It's better if I do it myself. After all, I am responsible for you. How noble, I slumped back, disheartened. After a moment, I continued quietly. You know, when I first got here, I was ready to die. After all, in the whole world, there's not a single soul who would care whether I'm alive or dead. When I'm gone, no one will mourn. No one will even remember I existed. My face was full of sorrow. However, in a moment, the sorrow vanished, replaced by joy. But then I changed my mind. At some point, I decided to survive. I must survive no matter what. The guard gave me a thoughtful look. To live a worthy life, he asked. I smirked. A dark gleam appeared in my eyes. No, I want to survive just to spite you all. The young guard was silent for a few moments, then nodded, accepting this answer. He stood up. Don't worry, I'll make it quick. Aren't you too confident? Why do you think you can kill me? Maybe it'll be me who kills you. The guard shook his head. I doubt it. However, the next second he staggered and fell to one knee. The young man's face turned deathly pale, and with a painful groan he suddenly coughed up blood. A satisfied smirk appeared on my face. Finally. The guard was on his knees, the lower half of his face covered in blood. Stunned, he looked at his hands, trying to understand what had happened to him. What is this? Why? With widened eyes and a pale face, he turned to me. I shrugged. I poisoned all of you. The guard flinched, trying to make sense of my words. What? I squeezed the juice of a poisonous berry that I found on the mountain into every flask except my own. When all of you were busy looking for suitable weapons, back in that damn camp. Not too much, to make its taste noticeable, but enough to slowly kill anyone who would drink from them. The guard clenched his teeth, fighting the pain. A look of realization suddenly appeared on his face. So that's why the other two were in such bad shape. I nodded. The blonde drank the most, so his condition worsened faster. The doctor didn't have long left in this world either. But you finished him off before the poison could. And you. The poison seemed to have no effect on you at all. I was starting to worry. The guard's face darkened. I see, I understand. He pondered for a moment, then looked at me in surprise. But at that moment you didn't know that we would turn against you. I just laughed. Come on. It was obvious. The blonde was the type who would kill for a pair of boots. The doctor was a wolf in sheep's clothing. People are selfish and cruel even at their best times. Was I really supposed to believe that those two wouldn't do something terrible to me when faced with certain death? The guard spat out more blood. Then, what about me? You're the worst of them. Why? Maybe I haven't learned much in my short life, but I know one important thing. There's nothing more pitiful than a prisoner who starts to trust his guard. Hearing these words, the guard lowered his head. I see. Then, suddenly he laughed. You're a vicious little bastard, aren't you? I rolled my eyes. There's no need to be so crude. All right, that's good. My conscience will be clearer. What are you muttering about? Just die already. The guard smirked and suddenly pierced me with an intense look. Somehow he no longer seemed so ill. You see, that plan would have worked if I were a prisoner, but us guards are provided with various medicines, including antidotes, before an expedition. We drank several of those medicines. As unpleasant as the poison may be, it can't kill me. Damn. I turned and tried to flee, but it was already too late. Something struck me in the back, sending my body crashing into a stone wall. I felt a sharp pain piercing the left side of my chest. Rolling out of the cave, I clutched at my chest, got to my feet, and ran, trying to escape the narrow crevice. I managed to reach the old trail, and I could finally see the stars and the pale moon brightly shining in the night sky. But that was as far as I could go. Stop. When a cold voice sounded behind me, I froze. I stood no chance in a fight with the guard. Turn around. I obediently turned, raising my hands. I looked at the guard, who was wiping blood from his face with displeasure in his eyes. We looked at each other, shivering in the murderous cold. Was it worth it? It doesn't matter. Despite everything, I'll keep my promise. I'll make it quick. He drew a gun. Any last words? I remained silent, contemplating the situation. And in that critical moment, what I call the irony of my fate occurred. For the first time in all my years of life, luck smiled at me, if you could call it luck. Behind the guard appeared a werewolf, quietly sneaking up on us. "Why are you silent?" the guard said loudly. His voice was quite menacing, but I still did not respond. I just trembled from the cold and tried not to moan, despite the throbbing pain in my chest. Holding my breath, I watched in horror as the colossal figure approached the guard. My lungs burned and my heart pounded like crazy. It beat so loudly that I was afraid the blind werewolf would hear it. But of course, the heartbeat could not be louder than the guard's voice, who kept talking, making himself the only source of noise on this mountain. In the last second, a hint of understanding appeared in the young guard's eyes. He began to turn and ready his pistol for firing, but it was too late. Out of the darkness, a massive paw gripped him with an iron hold. Bone claws scratched at his leather clothes, tearing them apart. The werewolf dragged the guard toward him, paying no attention to the shots. Viscous saliva dripped from his open mouth. Frozen with fear, I slowly turned my back to them and took a few steps on the old, winding trail. Then I broke into a run, as fast as I could. Behind me, a desperate scream tore through the night silence. Then a roar followed, and suddenly there was a loud explosion. It turned out the guard was not going to go down without a fight, although his fate was already sealed. What was that? Could it have been a grenade? I thought. But it didn't matter now. I was running, making my way back, descending lower and lower. A lone, dark mountain stood against the raging winds. Rocky and proud, it towered above the other peaks of the mountain range, cutting through the night sky with its sharp edges. The shining moon lit its slopes with a ghostly pale light. Under this light, a young man with pale skin and black hair descended from the mountaintop. However, his appearance did not match the grandeur of the scene. Battered and staggering, he looked pathetic and weak. It was me, more like a walking corpse. My cloak was torn and stained with blood. My sunken eyes were cloudy and lifeless. My whole body was bruised, scraped, and cut. My lips bore spots of bloody foam. I hunched over, clutching the left side of my chest. Each step made me groan, and labored breathing barely escaped through clenched teeth. My entire body ached, but more importantly, I was cold. Very, very cold. I wanted to just lie down in the snow and fall asleep. But instead, I kept going, because I believed the nightmare was over. The werewolf was no longer chasing me. Apparently, the young guard had done me one last favor and blown himself up along with the monster. Well, thanks to him for that. Step and step. Another step. And finally, I made it. I was free.